Welcome back to the Telling All podcast with Juan Rodriguez. Thank you for joining us for episode 2, which will be another solo episode aside from the introduction. And I suppose I'd like to start it off by saying, hi, how are ya? I hope the last week has been kind to you all as it has been to me. And I thought I'd start this week's episode, the first official solo episode, from a place of gratitude, which is defined as the quality of being thankful or a readiness to show appreciation for and to return kindness, which is something that's always, as long as I can remember at least, been second nature to me. I don't often speak highly of myself for not wanting to come off arrogant or prideful. So, I've stuck to, essentially, only referring to the positive qualities that others have observed in me, that have been confirmed at least 3 times. During the course of a training that I had the pleasure of undergoing last year, which I won't name because they're not affiliated and I'm not quite sure on the legality of all that. But that is to say, they have an expression when it comes to compliments or gifts that are observed in you, qualities that you can assign meaning to. And kindness is one of those gifts. A grateful attitude, a respect for circumstance that I may not understand in the moment is something that's been attributed to my way of life, my way of being, so to speak. If you study Lao Tzu, then I'm sure that resonates with you. But simply put, I've been told I have a gift for language, and that is something that I am eternally grateful for. I suppose you could say I have an ear for it. And not just the Latin-based languages of which Spanish and the other Romance languages fall into. I have a deep appreciation for all types, truly. I like to pick up phrases and greetings in Bengalese, Arabic, the Egyptian dialect, which has been confirmed to me by about 3 Egyptians this year alone, is a lot easier on the tongue. And I have had an affinity for the Japanese language since I was a wee boy, And language shapes the way we see the world, according to a movie by the name of Arrival. And my wife and I left that theater in awe. It was a very quiet car ride home for the first few minutes. And the way that language is used in that movie is a masterclass in storytelling. But through language, you encounter many things that you try your best to put into words. That's where you get cliches and platitudes, things that have been said so many times that they lose, I guess, originality. But the meaning is still there. I mean, it wouldn't be overused if it didn't drive a point home. And idioms, I believe, are very fascinating, simply because they don't always translate well into the other language. And that's a joke that I saw on Archer, but it put to words exactly why. Some things you just can't translate. Being called stubborn or hard-headed somewhere with a more literal culture would be, okay, his head is very hard, he is tough. Or in other languages where they're much more literal, let's say. And you might ask for directions and say, hey, do you know the way to this place? And they'll simply respond, yes. There's no animosity in that. It's just a literal language. You have to phrase your questions a little differently. But there is a language where the people speak very poetically. For example, instead of saying, "Oh, I'm so full," they say something to the effect of, "Oh, my belt is so stressed," to express the gratitude for the meal which they just partook. And it's a beautiful thing. But aside from the spoken language, I am very grateful for the written language. I must have about a dozen of these composition notebooks ranging in color and topics from growth, whatever that means to you, to health, to medications and side effects, to mood journals, to dream journals, to poetry, to quotes that I really just sat with and had to collect somewhere, like my own personal Bartletts, right? And the first time I heard of Bartlett's was in a movie called Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, and it was a book of these quotes that one of the characters picked up in an effort to impress someone. But I suppose I collect these for myself simply because one quote, decades later, still sticks with me. How happy is the blameless vessel's lot, the world forgetting by the world forgot. Eternal sunshine of the spotless mind, each prayer answered and each wish resigned. And in Googling that after the movie, wondering what kind of sentiment was trying to be expressed by such beautiful language, Understanding that while you may love each other, you've taken oaths, and you must honor your word, and you must forgo that which you hold dear to fulfill your lot in life. Each prayer answered and each wish resigned. You pray for nothing but the best for your beloved and your wish to be together. You forgo it simply because that would be against who they are, who they were, who they've always been. That always resonated with me. If you love something, let it go. If it comes back to you, it's yours. If it doesn't, it never was. DMX, baby. But it's through my gratitude for language and expressing myself that I find myself blessed to be here in front of a microphone, just sharing my thoughts, seemingly at random. But I'll tell you what's random. A nice notebook titled Brilliant Ideas I Had While Pooping. I don't carry this thing into the bathroom with me, but any ideas that make it out, whether that be in the shower or brushing my teeth, they go right in that bad boy. My wonderful mother-in-law got that for me as a gift. I filled that bad boy up almost without thinking, just because of that wonderful little cue, so to speak, on the cover. And the quality of being thankful is something that is instilled in children from a young age. How often have we heard an adult or someone who's just trying to help pointing out when we were in fact ungrateful? How many of us questioned if that was true? How many of us, even further still, questioned if there was some truth to the accusation? Was it perhaps how we were showing up? People aren't mind readers. A simple thank you can go a long way. A little acknowledgement can make even the most strenuous circumstances seem bearable, as long as you are seen. You understand? But if you put on a brave face and you don't make it seem like it bothers you, then people seem to get this almost superhuman idea of what you're capable of. And while that might give you strength, it's a double-edged sword. Because when you are not at your best, but you are able to show up as if you were, and you try to express with your language just how weary you are, let's say. It's not that it falls on deaf ears, it's more that there's a conflict between the way you are perceived and the words that are coming out of your mouth. It's a contradiction, if you will, and I'm grateful for those too. Contradictions are, in my experience, someone trying to express something that almost can't be expressed. So you call on two extremes, hoping that someone might be able to read between the lines and get to the meat and potatoes, the essence, the nature, if you will, of the speech. And I think that poetry falls beautifully into that category. How do you express the inexpressible? Suppose you could adopt flowery language. But really, it's just using every tool in your verbal arsenal to point towards the essence of something. It's very simple. You have individuals that try all the time. And perhaps you've heard something along the lines of, joy wouldn't feel so good if it wasn't for pain, or sunny days wouldn't be so special if it wasn't for rain. It's a little backwards, but they say penny for your thoughts. That's about 50 cents worth of knowledge right there. And I know that none of you are likely the Loch Ness Monster, but I'd still like to give you about $3.50 worth of knowledge with this episode. That's a South Park reference for those who are a little more cultured than I. But simply put, how do you know what things to be grateful for in the moment as they're happening? I don't think that's for us to decide. So early on, I adopted the worldview, come what may, so to speak. Back to last week's episode, accept whatever comes to you woven in the fabric of your destiny for what could better suit your needs. Because we are creatures with a fixed view on time, we can only experience it linearly. So who are we to say that today's trials and tribulations will not be of benefit in the future? And at the very least, perhaps our experience will be something that we can bring to others and perhaps help them navigate the same situation or a similar one in a better manner. At least a manner that is at least 1 degree of deviation better than your experience. So I'd like to start with my own contradiction. I'm very grateful that I've totaled exactly 2 cars in my life. The first one had to be, before 2015 easily, because I wasn't at my current job. And my wife and I were in the first year or so of our relationship. And she invested in me and helped me get a Mercury. It was a very nice car. And because we were still dating and I hadn't proven my intentions with that wonderful woman just yet, young woman, fresh out of college, by about a year or so, getting ready to do grad school, whole life in front of her. And who was I? Some humble retail manager, no college education. I don't think she thought these things, but I wasn't exactly from the highest stock, so to speak. I was from Bridgeport, the place where everyone in Connecticut likes to pretend doesn't exist, in my experience. A world unto itself. But simply put, there was one evening in the wintertime where she and I fell asleep watching a movie. That's the God's honest truth. I can disclose this way. Clothes were on. There was nothing going on. It was quite literally, I had shown her one of my favorite movies. She loved it, and I think we ran it back and just passed out. And her mother very respectfully knocked on the door and told the daughter, my wife, girlfriend at the time, that I had to go. About 1 o'clock in the morning on a freezing night. I don't blame her for what came next. I blame myself. Simply put, my wife was a bit indignant. She didn't see the big deal, but I understood that it was a boundary being enforced in her mother's home. And I simply had to abide it. My honor as a man simply would not let anything come of that. I wanted to respect boundaries that were plainly stated. Simple as that. Didn't matter the hour. I was grateful that I had a vehicle and I could leave and I didn't have to ask her to drive me home, because where she stayed, there were no buses. There was no public transportation. It was a world unto itself, so to speak. And that evening, as I was driving home, I hit a patch of black ice on Route 25, right before exit 3, where I wanted to get off and drive through the back roads to get to the east end in the one-bedroom apartment where I was staying. And I wasn't driving very fast. I was driving maybe 40 miles an hour. I was taking it slow. There was almost no one on the road. And I know you're supposed to slow down by, let's just call it 25% in conditions that are less than ideal. And there was a black ice warning. And I was very wary of black ice. I knew certain things about how you should operate with black ice. You shouldn't slam the brake. You shouldn't overcorrect, things of that nature. But practical knowledge is completely different than experiencing it for yourself. So when I hit a huge patch of black ice, I regained control momentarily and then hit the rest of that patch. And my Mercury spun and spun and spun. And I hit a guardrail and car was totaled. But it didn't look totaled. It was just a dent near the engine, you know what I mean? It just seemed like it was fine. But I remember the feeling of weightlessness. I remember the utter panic as I lost control. You might be asking yourself, how could you be grateful for something like that, right? I made it out alive. I didn't need my whole life flashing before my eyes to realize that there were certain things in this world that I did care about, regardless of how much I tried to tell myself I didn't. And my life was one of those. A life that I wanted to share with that girl. And I got out of the vehicle. I sat on the side of the road. I called my mother. I lit up a cigarette. I hung up with my mother and lit up another cigarette because I was in shock. This is the first time I've done this, and I was just double fisting them as I was trying to figure out what to do. The obvious answer when you're not in shock is call 911, right? Well, luckily some good Samaritan pulled over and saw me, and then a cop pulled over. The moral of that story is that cop told me I was going too fast, even though I articulated I was going no faster than 40, and that's well under the limit that you're supposed to drive, let's say 25%. But he still gave me a citation on top of my car being totaled. And I understand that he was just doing his job. But a little compassion could have gone a long way. I suppose I could say, oh, he didn't cite me for reckless driving or what have you, but he might as well have. Literally, a vehicle that I hadn't paid back. Gone. Just like that. And I was back to riding the bus, and that became a point of contention. Because mothers do what mothers do. And they want to protect their children from being taken advantage of. And I took that as a challenge. Because I knew that I loved my wife even then. Before the words were uttered. And I made it a point to bridge the gap, so to speak, even with one arm tied behind my back. I was catching the closest bus to where she lived, and I was making it work to prove that I wanted to see her, regardless if I could use her vehicle as a means of transportation. And I understand that this was not something that was conscious. This was not something that was malicious. It was a valuable life lesson, if I'm being honest. I had to prove that I was willing to invest my time and my body running miles, walking miles, simply put, to get to her. And we have a wonderful relationship now. That's not the issue. The issue was getting to the point where the trust was earned. And in my wife's defense, she absolutely defended me every step of the way. She knew I was not like that. She knew that I genuinely cared. And she still does, almost 10 years later. That was a very valuable lesson. That there were people out there willing to invest in me, and people willing to call me to a higher version of myself. You could argue that it was something that was there all along, for sure. I'd like to believe it was. And simply put, those were some of the best days. And I wasn't grateful for it because I loved that car. It was very me, if I can say so myself. And it seemed like this big waste, but in hindsight, I needed that. That was my first wake-up call. Be more careful, to value the time that I've been given, to value what people invest in me when they don't have any real idea other than faith. Now, I've told you all that I've totaled 2 cars. So some years after that, about 4.5 years ago, in December of 2019, after a brief stint in the hospital and a cocktail of meds, I was having trouble acclimating. If I can be blunt, I was a walking zombie. And it was 3 or 4 days before Christmas. I was in my Chrysler 300, a car that was bequeathed to me by my mother while she went off and got herself a truck which she was much more accustomed to. I'm not even kidding. I've seen her whip that bad boy in parking lots and reverse into a spot with a single fluid motion. My mama can drive, y'all. And she is much better off with a truck or any sort of vehicle with more seats. Simply because we have a large family. I was grateful that she decided to go for a truck and entrust me with that vehicle and taking over the loan for it. Because my Crown Vic at the time decided to crap the bed. And I did need a vehicle, and my wife, or my girlfriend at the time, were making it work with one vehicle. We worked not too far apart. But simply put, after having the vehicle for a little while, it was very me. Also, I did cherish that car. About 4 days before Christmas, I flipped that bad boy over in the wee hours of the morning. Between 5 and 6, because it was a very early start time back then. I couldn't have been out of control for more than a second. And hit a curve, flipped, and landed upside down. And again, I recall that feeling of weightlessness, that surrender in that moment. If it's my time, it's my time. That's what I thought. This is now the second time that I've lost control of a vehicle. And I'd been driving professionally for years at this point. But between my cocktail of goodies and the sleep deprivation of working 60, 70-hour weeks the entirety of the Christmas season, it all kind of caught up to me. And I'm grateful because perhaps my exhaustion caused me to go limp at just the right time. And the paramedics told me the term for what I did is called self-extricating from a vehicle, which just means I removed myself from the car. I couldn't roll the windows down. The door wouldn't open. I took a deep breath, said a little prayer. I went to the other side because the driver's side was a no-go. I could see the indentation on the door. And I didn't have a seatbelt cutter or a windshield glass breaker at this time. I do now, and I advise everyone to keep one in their vehicle, especially after recent events. So I went to the passenger side, and I kicked with all my might. And first try, nailed it. And again, I got out. And because I was in shock, my cigarettes were in my coat pocket. I lit one of those bad boys up. I don't advise anybody smoke. It's not a wise decision. You'll feel a lot better when you quit if you already do. Believe me, as a matter of direct experience. That aside, you think I called the cops first? No. I called my office. I spoke with my supervisor with a cigarette in hand and told her I flipped my car. I'm going to be a little late. I don't think I can come into work today. I just wasn't thinking that far ahead. And I hang up the phone because people had already pulled over and were seeing if I was okay. I got out without a scratch, guys. Powerful. Without a scratch. I walked to the nearest rock and sat. And people approached me and they called the cops for me. And again, I lit up a second cigarette. And I'm just double fisting these things because I'm in shock and anxiety hasn't quite rushed. And I have this adrenaline rush and chills just thinking about it. But before long, before the accident was cleaned up, I say 5 minutes, my supervisor was there. And I'm very grateful to her. And my wife, who was my fiance, I believe at the time, came and got me, took me to Norwalk Hospital. But my boss, my supervisor, had to let me know that my priorities were a little out of whack. No, I wasn't going to work today. Yes, it's a few days before Christmas, but we'll figure it out. You literally are up and walking from something that could have easily killed you. My birds are happy that my wife is home, as am I. Yet I am here recording instead of... But I get to do both. And they're chirping. Not driving me nuts, just chirping. Thank you, Lord. My supervisor made it clear in no uncertain terms that I would not be returning to work. I needed to go get a CAT scan. I needed to go to the hospital no matter how good I felt. And I'm grateful for the mustard seed. I'm grateful for the faith that I've had since I was a boy. That seems to be at play in moments like these, whether I acknowledge it or not. Twice. 2 separate instances where I could have lost my life, I'm grateful for, simply because it lets me know just how deeply I appreciate it. And the people around me who take time to remind me to take care of myself. So I went to that hospital. I got the CAT scan and I was fine. I was afraid I might have had a TBI, a traumatic brain injury. I'm no stranger to concussions, that's for sure. I thought I might have had a DAI. I thought I only felt so good because there was something wrong. Because of that cocktail I mentioned, it was pretty hard to feel anything, if I'm honest. So that was a bit scary. The simple fact of the matter is, I walked away from that wreckage and it didn't leave a dent. In the vehicle, sure, but it was built for that. And I was a little sore after the adrenaline wore off, but I was just grateful because I hadn't had the opportunity to marry my wife. I hadn't had the opportunity to truly express myself. And that's something that led me to taking my health a lot more seriously. You might ask yourself, how did it do that? I mean, with the gratitude of surviving a second near-fatal car crash, realizing that my life was worth living and that I would be missed, something I knew. But you like to tell yourself that people get over it. Me personally, I can't tell anyone what to do after I'm gone, but I don't wish to be mourned. Celebrate, rejoice. I've gone home. Celebrate my life and know that we will see each other again. That's just been my attitude for as long as I can remember. Since my first encounter with death, I couldn't have been older than 4. But simply put, I began to take my health seriously. In the years after that, I quit smoking. I'd only picked it back up because my job was stressful, but really I just wasn't coping well. I didn't know how to ask for support. And that manifests in different ways for everyone. So I went back to the devil I knew. Nicotine, baby. And it's one of those things where you know it's no good for you, yet you continue to do it for the immediate relief, so to speak. But like my wrestling coach Santiago used to say, if you can do it once, you can do it every time. So I did. I put the cigarettes down. I found other ways to cope. Deep breathing exercises, the Wim Hof method, the Iceman. I took up meditation. I took up mindfulness. I didn't tell many people, but I took up my Bible again at that time. The first of many times, if I'm honest. And I began to work on my physical as well as my mental. I was at a very low weight because I had been dieting and meal prepping and doing all of these things. And that cocktail that I keep referencing ballooned me up to the highest weight I've ever been in my life. Almost 260. I'm not a short man, but 260 does not look good on me. It does not at all. And I began researching the medications that were prescribed to me by an individual that walked out upon hearing the words sexual trauma. And I don't know if this doctor recused himself because of something he hadn't dealt with, but I will tell you now, the feeling of disrespect was palpable. Being diagnosed for symptoms that quite literally fit the diagnosis that I currently have. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I believe everyone who grew up in Bridgeport has some form of it. That's a story for another day. So this individual didn't listen and prescribed me quite a few things to level me out, so to speak. And I'm grateful for that because I learned all the medications, their interactions with things like citrus and other things of that variety. And I started logging my moods, so to speak, and finding out that I didn't have mood swings. There was a clear trigger every time a shift happened, but I was too afraid to utter these things aloud, not knowing that simply speaking these experiences aloud would release me from their clutches. I began to devour with a voracious appetite everything I could find on mental health, self-help, DBT, CBT, occupational behavioral therapy. I began to understand myself on a level hitherto undreamt of. Yes, I'm quoting Dr. Strange. And in doing so, I was able to help others around me. And these are not assumptions that I've made. These are things that have been told to me. by friends, by strangers who became friends. I began to use my hypervigilance as a tool, as feedback, when every fiber of my body was in fight or flight, and leaning into the feeling. For months after that second accident, every time I got into my mail truck, my hands would tremble. And I began to take note of my self-soothing behaviors. And I began to note when they would occur, what I was thinking about, what places I would go to. And the missing component of all that was simply expression. In not expressing these things aloud, they got to sit in the echo chamber of my mind and warp and twist, and it didn't have to be that way, but I tell myself I'm grateful that it was. Again, maybe I can save somebody from doing the same, torturing themselves, going back and forth behind a cigarette in their mind, trying to reconcile the extremes of their experience. And I'm grateful for my office because I had a feeling that I belonged, that I could be someone. And a mail truck isn't a particularly fast car, but it is a place of solitude for myself and many like myself. A place of great learning and connection. It is my mobile fortress of solitude where I was able to educate myself on over 107 books in the course of a couple years. And a lot more if I go to the library apps where I was able to get these audiobooks for free. Oh, hello, Willie. I am joined by a very special guest. And in further exploring my experience of not being heard by certain professionals and being dismissed and really choosing my language very carefully, I was able to distinguish those who listened to understand me and those who simply wished to dismiss me for some sense of superiority that I do not wish to comprehend, if I'm being completely honest. But I've learned to identify individuals like that, and in cutting them off or cutting them out and wishing them nothing but the best or all that they deserve, I found peace. So you can see, gratitude for me is a very complex emotion because it involves disconnecting from time, which has never really been quite linear for me. It's always been more frenetic. Because memories for me are more than just images, they're a feeling, and in leaning into that feeling, I can find myself in the moment, sensations, textures, they come back to me. And with this knowledge, I'm truly blessed. Blessed to know that I can disappear anytime I want to. Because again, what would joy be without pain? What would up be without down? What would life be without death? A life without end wouldn't have any meaning. Because time, I suppose you could say, would be a flat circle. And that's not a perspective it is meant for us. For you see, eternity is a lock found inside our hearts, and we've handed humanity the key. And in my isolation, I embrace the power of now, thanks to Master Toll. And I became addicted to being present, seeking out the light in others, something you can see in their eyes. For those who know. I began to discover people that had eyes that could see and ears that could hear like myself. And while we might not believe the same things, you come to understand that we believe in the full human experience and surrender to the simple fact that we cannot possibly fathom all that is before us. We can imagine, we can pray, we can wish, we can plan. But at the end of the day, we just have to have faith that it's all for something. And I've chosen to be grateful every step of the way. And even when I forget myself, I choose as soon as I'm able. Good times wouldn't feel so good without the bad ones. You wouldn't be able to see how far you've come if you haven't stumbled a little bit. And in my experience, rock bottom has a basement. And under that basement, there's a trap door, and you can free fall for a long, long time. And all you need to do is ask for a little help and support. And for me, that was very difficult. But I'm so grateful that I learned how. And understanding that I didn't get any brain injury from that accident, that my mind wasn't broken, it was just fractured, and that it wasn't a labyrinth like Nietzsche posed, but rather a palace that I get to build brick by brick, whose foundation is bedrock. So I suppose I'll end with this. What experiences are you grateful for that you weren't in the moment? Because hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. So, to posit it a different way, what was something that seemed like the end of the world when you were going through it that may have led to something greater? Leave your answer in the comments. Like, share, subscribe. And I'll see you all next week.